I heard all things in heaven and in earth. I heard many things in hell. Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart.
Chief of Police Madowitz, you can rest easy now as I have come to sunny California for the winter. I felt bad operating on all those people, but science must advance. I shall assound the medical profession a man only with a DC. What did their lives mean in comparison to hundreds of sick and disease-twisted bodies? Just a laboratory of guinea pigs found on any public street. No one missed them when I failed. My last case was successful. I know now the feeling of Pasteur, Thoreau, and other pioneers. Right now, I have a volunteer who will absolutely prove my theory. They call me mad and a butcher, but the truth will out. I have failed but once here. The body has not been found and never will be. But the head, minus the features, is buried on Century Boulevard between Western and Crenshaw. I feel it is my duty to dispose of the bodies as I do. It is God's will not to let them suffer. X.
This is Kimberly.
And I'm Kristen, and welcome to the Murder and Myths podcast, episode 6, Cut My Life into Pieces.
Between 1935 and 1940, the city of Cleveland was slowly recovering from the Great Depression. Areas like Millionaire Row were flourishing, and the Great Lakes Exposition and the Republican National Convention were slated to happen in 1936. It was expected to bring a large tourist population to the area. While most of the areas at the time were improving and recovering economically, the small impoverished area known as Kingsbury Run was going to have itself put on the map forever. Kingsbury Run was located on the south side of Cleveland. The area contained a natural watershed that ran through East 79th Street and carried storm water to the Cuyahoga River. The Great Depression hit this area hard. Most of the run was scattered and looked like a post-apocalyptic dystopia. It was covered with overgrown weeds, trash, and abandoned hollowed-out cars. It wasn't uncommon to see old Brownie newspapers tumbling down the quiet, desolate roads. A large group of dilapidated homes created hobo camps that were collected along a long ravine. The ravine would plunge in some areas as far as 60 feet and was angled towards downtown. It was a desolate region where most of the population came through on the trains when it was warm and then would leave the area in the winter. The area east of the run was known as the Roaring Third, which was home to bars, brothels, and gambling dens as well as flop houses. Kingsbury Run got its name after James Kingsbury, who was one of the earliest settlers in Western Reserve. What seems like an innocent group of neighborhoods in the 30s had no idea they would become the backdrop for a killer's dumping grounds. A young man hanging around on the shore of Lake Erie in the fall of September 1934 sees something on the shoreline. As he approaches the object and leans in closer to investigate, he is shocked to discover the object is the lower half of a woman's torso. With the thighs still attached, the legs had been amputated at the knees and the rest of the limbs and head were missing. The body was collected by the coroner, and his examination revealed that the body had some sort of chemical on it which caused the body to turn bright red, tough, and leathery. They established that the woman was in her mid-30s and her head was never found. The police named her the Lady of the Lake, Victim 0. Later in the year, in September 1935, two boys are walking home from school on a cool afternoon when one of the boys challenges the other to a race down a hill known in the area as Jackass Hill. The boy agrees to the challenge and takes off down the hill at full speed. He makes it to the bottom before his friend and starts to catch his breath by walking in slow circles around the area. His eyes catch the attention to something white in the bushes just a short distance away, and he calls his friend to come down the hill to help him investigate. The boys creep closer to the bush only to discover a naked body that was only wearing a pair of black socks and missing its head. When the police searched the area, they noticed a patch of human hair that was protruding from the ground. They discovered it was the top of a human head, and located close by was a pair of male genitals. The fingerprints ID'd the body as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old white male. Edward had a minor police record and had a reputation for getting drunk at the local bars and getting into fights. He was also a rumored homosexual who was a regular at the Roaring Third. The police knew that Edward had a bad reputation and figured they would be able to track down the killer by following his path. He was known at the gambling parlors, bars, and rumored to have a prostitution ring of young girls. Investigators followed leads and interviewed the enemies of Edward, but every clue came up to a dead end and no suspects were found. The coroner determined that Edward's body was cleaned and drained of blood. He had rope burns around the wrists and his genitals had been removed. They determined he had been dead for about 3 days. The pathologist discovered that Edward died from the decapitation and had been alive at the time. They could tell by the rope burns that he struggled and fought and tried to break free from his captor. The police discovered about 30 feet from Edward's body was another naked man, who was decapitated and his genitals removed. The victim had the same preservative that was used on the Lady of the Lake on his body, and he had been dead for a couple of weeks. Both of the men were dumped like garbage and murdered elsewhere from where they were found. This 40-year-old white male was never identified. The investigators suspect that the killer of these men might be a butcher or surgeon due to the precision and skillfulness of the kills. During the winter in January 1936, a woman discovers 2 picnic baskets that contained a bunch of packages wrapped in newspaper. Curiosity struck the best of her, so she leaned down to investigate the baskets further and began to unwrap the newspaper. She discovered that the meat inside was about half of a female body. The baskets were left along the Hart Manufacturing Building. Everything but the head was recovered, and just like the rest, the cause of death was decapitation. The coroner discovered that the killer waited for rigor mortis to set in before disarticulating the rest of the body. Fingerprints ID'd the victim to be Florence Polio, who was a barmaid and a prostitute. The head of a white male was discovered by 2 young boys and was wrapped in a pair of pants close to the 55th Street Bridge in the summer of 1936. Police find the rest of the body, sans head, and determine it to be of a 20-year-old man. He was dumped in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad police building and his body was cleaned and drained of its blood. The body had notable tattoos on parts of his body and clear fingerprints were made. He had tattoos which consisted of a bird, the name Helen and Paul on his inner side of his left forearm, a heart with an anchor in red and blue, a flag with the initials WCG, a butterfly on his left shoulder, a head of a comic character called Jiggs on his left ankle, and Cupid was on his right ankle. His underwear had the initials JD on the inside. The police made a death mask in efforts to ID him, but he went unidentified. The death mask ended up being put on display in the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936. They coined this John Doe the tattooed man. A teenage girl finds the decapitated remains of a 40-year-old white male in July 1936. She was taking an afternoon walk through the woods of Clinton Road and Big Creek. The victim had been determined to have been dead about 2 months and his head and a pile of clothing were located near the body. There was bloodstains located on his coat and a blue polo shirt. They believe that the man was killed at the site, for large amounts of blood was discovered where the body was found. No other clues were found except the clothing. In September 1936, a homeless man is running hard along the railroad tracks trying to jump a train when suddenly he trips and misses the opportunity for a free ride. When he collects himself, he discovers that the object he tripped over was the upper half of a man's torso. As police search the area and find the lower half of the torso and parts of both of the legs in a large open sewer, they send a diver in. Over 600 people gathered to watch the diver retrieve the body parts, and people often wondered if the killer was amongst them while the parts were being taken out of the pool. This made victim number 6. The victim was in his late 20s and decapitated. The coroner stated that the head had been cut off with one bold, clean stroke. The victim had died instantly. The papers now coined the killer as the Mad Butcher and referred to the case as the Cleveland Torso Murders. The mayor starts to put a lot of pressure on the police departments to solve the case. The most pressure was put towards the recently appointed safety director named Eliot Ness. The mayor requests him to get involved into the case and to meet with the police to create a profile for someone who could do these killings. Now, where have you heard the name Eliot Ness before? How did Ness go from Chicago to Ohio? His backstory takes us to back 5 years prior to the murders in Cleveland. Ness had been a prohibition agent and became known for his efforts in bringing down Al Capone. He also started to enforce prohibition in Chicago. When he joined the U.S. Treasury Department in 1926, he was appointed to work with a 100-strong Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. In 1930, Frank Loesch of Chicago Crime Commission asked President Hoover to take down Al Capone. Hoover came up with the idea to send a small team of prohibition agents to target the illegal breweries and supply routes of Capone while gathering evidence of conspiracy. U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson chose 27-year-old Ness to lead this small squad. Ness knew there was a lot of corruption with Chicago's law enforcement agents and went through records of all the prohibition agents in order to create a reliable team of 6 men that was later known as the Untouchables. The Untouchables would, many years later, spark movies, books, and a TV series. Within 6 months of forming the Untouchables, Ness agents destroyed $500,000 worth of bootlegging operations and caused $2 million worth of lost income for Capone. The raids cost Capone a total of approximately $9 million. The efforts of Ness and his team led Capone's indictment on 5,000 violations of the Vistula Act in 1931. The judge prevented the indictments and pursued the tax evasion case. On October 1931, Capone was convicted of 5 of the 22 tax evasion charges and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Ness and his agents escorted Capone to his train that would take him to prison. This was the only time the 2 men met face to face. Following the end of Prohibition in 1933, Ness was assigned as an alcohol tax agent throughout Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Then, in 1934, he was transferred to Cleveland, Ohio, where he was hired as the city's safety director. This put him in charge of the police and fire departments. He began a reform program which professionalized and modernized the police, stopping juvenile delinquency and improving traffic safety. He just happened to oversee the police department during these horrific murders. Now let's go back to November 1936. Cold weather starts rolling in and November elections happen. Harold Burton is reelected as mayor and the police put detectives Peter Marillo and Martin Zelowinski on the case full-time, and Coroner Pierce is replaced by Sam Gerber, who has a law degree and a dedication to medicine. A man enjoying a spring day walk in February 1937 finds the upper half of a torso of a woman washed up on the shore of Brethrenal. The coroner finds that the decapitation happened after she had died. 3 months later, the lower half of the woman's torso washes up on shore. They find the woman is in her mid-30s and she was never identified. In June 1937, a body is found who is decapitated and missing a rib, and the head was later recovered. This was the only African American victim. Dental work had led police to believe that it was possibly Rose Wallace. Exact identification wasn't able to be achieved since the dentist who carried out the dental work died years before. Some doubt remained per Rose's son that she had been missing about 10 months. However, the body was estimated to have been dead a year. This caused the body to not be positively ID'd. Labor problems caused riots, which were in full effect in the flats during the summertime. The National Guard was called in to maintain order. A guard that was watching the 3rd Street Bridge saw the first piece of victim number 9 in the wake of a passing tugboat. Over the next few days, the police found the rest of the body, minus the head, in the waters of the Cuyahoga River. The abdominal cavity had been gutted and the heart was ripped out, indicating a new element of viciousness in the killer's MO. The victim was in his mid-30s and he was never identified. The following spring, a young laborer is walking along the shores of the banks of the Cuyahoga River on his way to work in the flats. He stopped to look at what he thought was a dead fish, only to discover it was the lower half of a woman's leg. This would make victim number 10. A month later, the police skim out 2 burlap bags out of the river that ended up containing both parts of the torso and most of the legs. Coroner Gerber finds drugs in the system of the victim, but since the arms were missing, they couldn't determine if she was an IV drug user or had been bound. She was never identified. In August 1938, 3 men collecting scrap at a dump site at East 9th and Lakeside in August Find a men's double-breasted blazer that contained an object wrapped in an old quilt. Inside the quilt was the torso of a woman. The legs and arms were discovered in a makeshift box wrapped in brown butcher paper, and it was held together by rubber bands. The head had been similarly wrapped. Coroner Gerber found that some of the body parts had been refrigerated. While the police searched for more pieces of the body in the dump site, only a few yards away they discovered the remains of a second body. These two bodies were placed in a location that was in plain view of Eliot Ness's office window, almost as a taunt. Victims 11 and 12 were never identified. August 18, 1938, 12:40 a.m. Eliot Ness and 30 police officers and detectives raid the hobo jungles of the Run. 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, 3 fire trucks all descend on the largest cluster of makeshift shacks along the Cuyahoga River. They gathered up 63 men living in the camps, and at dawn, the police and firemen searched the shanties for clues. Then, on order of Safety Director Ness, the shanties were burned to the ground. The press highly criticized Ness for his actions, and the public was frustrated and afraid. The press said that the raid would do nothing to stop or solve the murders. In July 1939, Sheriff O'Donnell arrested 52-year-old bricklayer Frank Donizal for the murder of Flo Polio. Frank had lived with her for a while, and an investigation revealed that he had been acquainted with Edward Andrassy and Rose Wallace. His confession ended up being precise details and incoherent ramblings as if someone had coached him. Before his trial was to begin, Frank was found dead in his cell. The 5'8" Frank hanged himself from a hook only 5 feet 7 inches off the floor. His autopsy revealed that he had 6 broken ribs, which was believed to have happened in sheriff custody. No one believed he was the torso killer, but O'Donnell believed he was. The Cleveland torso murders left behind a lot of rumors about who the killer was, but Eliot Ness had a suspect that he believed was without a doubt the killer. He had suspected Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, who was a veteran of World War I and part of a medical unit who conducted amputations on the field. Sweeney was interviewed and failed to pass 2 of the early polygraph machine tests. Both of the tests were administered by Leonard Keeler, who told Ness he had the right suspect. Ness felt that there was going to be no chance Sweeney was going to be convicted since he was cousins to Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, one of Ness's political opponents. Martin L. Sweeney hounded Ness publicly about his failure to catch the killer. Francis Sweeney committed himself into a hospital where he would send threatening postcards with his name and mocked and taunted Ness and his family into the 1950s. Sweeney died in 1964 in a veterans hospital. As far as Eliot Ness goes, over the years he fell out of favor with the citizens of Cleveland after burning the shanties. He and his wife divorced shortly after. The media targeted Ness's divorce and his high-profile social drinking. He was involved in a drunk driving accident, and thankfully no victims were hurt, but he tried to cover it up. A local paper revealed the cover-up, and the public called for his resignation. Ness admitted he did his best to try to cover up the accident, but didn't want to lose his job. He held another government job and lost a few businesses that he owned, and he ended up remarrying and divorcing again. This time on his 3rd marriage, he started drinking more and telling stories in bars about his law enforcement career in Al Capone. He took a bunch of odd jobs to make ends meet and was struggling with money. And in 1953, he started a paper business which specialized in watermarking legal and official documents to prevent counterfeiting. In 1957, Ness collapsed in his home in Pennsylvania of a massive heart attack, and he was survived by his widow and adopted son. The Cleveland torso murders became the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. 1,500 people had been interviewed by the 2 main detectives, and the department as a whole interviewed more than 5,000 suspects. As of today, most of the police official records on this case have been lost, destroyed, or removed, and the death masks of the victims are still on display at the Cleveland Police Museum.
In Kim's murder case, we heard about many people whose bodies were dismembered in an unwilling sacrifice of their lives to further the chaos of the killer. Today, I will tell you of the tale of one from Norse mythology who willingly allowed dismemberment to preserve the order of the world. Loki had 3 children born of his union with the giant Angerboda, the serpent Jormungandr, a daughter named Hel, and the wolf called Fenrir. Some evil was to be expected from these 3 children due to the heritage of their Jotun mother and trickster father. However, even more misfortune and wretchedness was foretold about their fates. Word came to Asgard, home of the gods, that these 3 children were being fostered with the giants in Jotunheim. When this news found its way to Odin, he sent some of the gods to bring the children to him, so he could decide what best to do with them. The serpent, who was fated to kill and be killed by Thor, was thrown by Odin into the deep ocean waters. Here it encircled itself around Midgard, the land of men, biting his own tail. Hel, whose body was half blue, the color of the deceased, and the other half the hue of living flesh, was sent by Odin to Niflheim, the land of ice, to look after those who died of old age and sickness in her hall. The wolf Fenrir, who is foretold to kill the All-Father during Ragnarok, was too dangerous to send away. The gods thought in the wolf's case, keeping the enemy close would serve them better, and so the wolf pup was raised in Asgard among the mighty Aesir. Tyr, who was full of honor and the upholder of the law, was the only god among the Aesir who possessed the courage to feed and care for Fenrir. Each day he grew larger and larger and ate more and more. The wolf's ever-increasing size was a reminder to the gods of the destruction that Fenrir would cause come Ragnarok. The Aesir came to a decision that simply keeping watch over the wolf would no longer be sufficient. They could not trust this wolf to continue to roam free. They forged a strong chain called lading, in which to fetter the Fenris wolf. The gods told him they wanted to test his strength to see if he could break the bond, as doing so would earn him great fame. Fenrir took a look at the chain and judged that this would be an easy task, so he let the Aesir tie him up. The gods were quite pleased with themselves, as tricking the wolf had been simple to accomplish. Their joy was very temporary, for as soon as Fenrir began to struggle against his bonds, the links on the chain snapped, and he was soon free, proud of his show of strength. The Aesir returned to the drawing board, determined to craft a fetter stronger than lading. And they did. This second chain they called Drome. They told Fenrir that he would be even more famous, and his deeds told throughout the 9 realms, if he possessed the strength to break this chain. Fenrir took a look at Drome and saw that it was indeed stronger than lading. But he knew that he too had grown in strength since the first time he and the Aesir played this game. He allowed the Aesir to bind him with this stronger fetter, and again they looked pleased with their work. Fenrir shook his body and struggled against the chain until it broke into pieces which lay upon the ground. The gods and goddesses of Asgard began to worry that they may never be able to bind the wolf. Odin sent Skirnir, the messenger of the god Frey, to Svartalheim, the land of the dwarfs, to seek out some craftsmen to forge an unbreakable fetter. Up to the challenge, they took 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footsteps, the beard of a woman, the roots of mountains, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. From this the unbreakable fetter, a chain as smooth as silk and small as a ribbon, called Gleipnir, was made. Once the chain was in possession of the Aesir, they brought it with them to the Isle of Lingv, in which they had brought Fenrir for one more round of break the bonds. They showed the Fenris wolf this chain, and told him it was stronger than the chains before, and mightier than its thinness would suggest. Fenrir eyed the thin ribbon suspiciously, for he knew there would be no honor or fame gained for him breaking such a slender band. The Aesir assured him that it would be a great feat if he could break this bond. To make a real show of it, each of the gods and goddesses tried to break it with their hands, and none of them were able. Fenrir surmised that this band must have been made with craftiness and magic, and if that was the case, he may not be able to break it. The Aesir assured him that if he were not able to break the chain, they would immediately free him from the fetters. Fenrir called them out on this lie, for he knew if the Aesir managed to get him bound where he was unable to loose himself, they would turn their backs on him. Equally, though, the wolf did not want to be accused of cowardice, so he told the Aesir he would allow them to bind him with the thin chain of Gleipnir, only if one of the gods would place their hand into his mouth. If he could not break the chain, and the Aesir let him go, then there would be no harm. However, if he could not break the bonds of Gleipnir, and they refused to unbind him, Fenrir would claim the hand of that god. The Aesir looked back and forth among each other, none volunteering to take the wolf up on his offer, until Tyr, knowing the destruction the wolf would cause among the realms, stepped up and placed his right hand into the wide open mouth of Fenrir. They wound Gleipnir around the Fenris wolf, and he began to struggle against the bond. As he struggled, the chain grew stiffer and tightened itself around the body of Fenrir. The Aesir began to laugh as they had finally been able to bind the wolf who would kill the Allfather at Ragnarok. Hearing their laughter, Fenrir realized that he had been tricked by the Aesir and clamped his jaws down tightly against the wrist of Tyr and swallowed the hand of the god. Tyr walked away less one hand, having sacrificed it willingly to bind the dread wolf for the good of the 9 realms. The Aesir then took the chain and wrapped it against a rock and drove this rock deep into the earth. Fenrir thrashed about wildly with all his might, trying to escape the trap and gnashing his teeth to bite any of the Aesir who got too close. The gods placed a sword into the mouth of the wolf, resting the hilt into his lower jaw and the point into the top, forcing his jaws to stay open. The saliva runs from his mouth, forming the river Von. Fenrir howls terribly day and night and will lie in this place until Ragnarok. Stay tuned, because after this quick break, Kim and I will discuss the stories we just told in our reaction segment.
Norway reeling from twin attacks. First, a suspected car bomb.
Thomas Quick was known as Sweden's worst serial killer. Quick was convicted.
Kim Wall disappeared after boarding Madsen's submarine in Copenhagen harbour last August.
Terrorism, miscarriages of justice, serial killers, disappearances. From the known to the lesser known, we give you true crime from the dark and frozen regions of northern Europe. This is Nordic True Crime. Subscribe to our bi-weekly episodes on iTunes, Spotify, or on your podcast provider. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Nordic True Crime.
Well, thanks for listening to episode 6. Cut my life into pieces.
I don't know why it's so funny right now. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's been a day. It has been a day.
It's been a day, and I just got done pretty much explaining the entire Cats musical to you in about 10 seconds.
I still think it's nonsense and gibberish, but...
What would a play about cats be about, though?
Nonsense and gibberish.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fact that it ends on a cat going away to heaven in a tire, I mean, it's beautiful.
Yeah. Anyway, there were no cats. No, there was a cat in this episode. One of the impossible things that the dwarves used to build Gleipnir was, in fact, the sound of a cat's footsteps.
Okay. We'll do this out of order because we're already on this whole thing.
Right.
So we're going to talk about the myth first. But sound of cat's footsteps. Like, I have a... Okay.
Not Glitch's footsteps.
I was going to say, confession. I have a 22-pound monster cat. And he's not diabetic or anything crazy. He's just a big cat. Maybe part wild. I don't know. He's a black big ass cat. But the sound of his footsteps, I think he's like an intruder in my house in the middle of the night. I have hardwood floors and you hear him coming.
Right.
So it's like that whole, okay, for me, so if you have like a normal 9-pound cat.
Yes.
Okay, let's just say.
A normal cat.
Normal cat. Not a monster.
You're not going to hear his footsteps because cats are nimble.
So it's like that whole thing of like, a tree falling in the woods doesn't make a sound. One-handed clapping. Cat's footsteps.
Yes.
Now,
the 6 impossible things.
Yeah, the 6 impossible things were interesting because they're impossible.
Right.
Like, I mean, they're off, like the breath of a fish.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I guess you could get that kind of cruel, like meanly.
Yeah.
The roots of a mountain.
Mm-hmm. They don't have roots.
What if it has moss on it? What if it's a stalactite? Technically could be roots.
So we're like in a cave and that's the root. I mean,
it's part of the mountain.
Possibly.
It's like roots.
Yeah.
Spit of a bird.
The spittle of a bird. I guess birds don't have saliva and or drool.
What?
Well, that's...
okay.
It's supposed to be an impossible thing, so I'm guessing.
Okay.
Things that don't exist. They're things that don't exist. So they made that.
All right.
They made Gleipnir out of 6 things that don't exist.
Okay, a beard of a woman.
That one I have issues with. I'm like, that clearly exists.
That can clearly exist.
Rude.
Right.
Jeez.
I just think it's funny because your story kind of started out with a Grecian game show googly gawk or whatever.
Googly gawk. I don't even know what you're referring to right now.
Is that
according to Kim?
Wait, is that appropriate to say googly gawk?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Like blah.
Gobbledygook?
Gobbledygook. Grecian game show gobbledygook.
Oh yeah, where we're talking about the three kids of Loki and what Odin does with each one of them.
Okay, so in my world, they're kind of like Lock, Shock, and Barrel from like Nightmare Before Christmas, but they're just getting into a bunch of like capers and situations and shenanigans and just yeah. It was, I don't know. There's
these guys do, I mean, there is a prophecy that Odin gets that basically foretells, specifically we know that Odin knows that supposedly well, not supposedly, actually, Fenrir the wolf does kill him in Ragnarok. And Normungandr, the Midgard serpent, actually kills Thor, and Thor, it's like a mutual death. Like, Thor kills him, and then he dies, but his poison gets on Thor, and Thor takes 9 steps, and he dies. So we know, at least with those two, they're very involved in Ragnarok in a very negative, like, world-ending way.
Is an Odin, to remind me here, is Loki's father?
No, that's Marvel canon. In Norse myth, no, Odin and Loki have taken, they've sworn oaths to each other. So
like, what would they be?
Like
a relationship?
Like blood brothers. They're not related. They're not.
So
not that any of the gods are biologically related,
okay.
but to put it in that kind of term, there's no familial linkage between Odin and Loki.
So basically, like, Odin sees his bro Loki. Mm-hmm. Like, Loki's pretty much like a rock star roadie guy who's like partying hard and riding Harleys and shit. And like Odin sees like the kids struggling because the kids are like Beavis and Butthead and their buddy, and they're just ridiculous. And Odin finally is like the conservative guy, like the conservative brother that has like a really nice business tech job or something, or works at like a bank. And he's like, you got to reel these kids in. They're about to go down your dad's path of hell. And that's why one of his daughters' name's Hell. I'm just assuming like that's.
Well, I mean, you're assuming that it's associated with like the Christian term of hell. It's hell with one L, and not related to the Christian version of like hellfire and brimstone. Okay. The place that she kind of rules is not the place where like murderers and cheats and like really bad people end up when they die. So
I always picture Loki kind of like a jester.
He definitely has a trickster trickster archetype about him. You never quite know where Loki stands on anything at any given time. There's times where he's done some things to the gods which were like really helpful, like when we talked about on our April Fool's episode where he goes with Thor to help find the hammer. He flies with Freya's cloak.
I think he was just fucking with Thor because he's like, let's see this dude in a dress. Like, I think it was one of those things where you're like, he wanted to see how far Thor was going to take this. Let's be real.
I mean, he did. I don't doubt that he took some enjoyment out of the situation. But I mean, before even the thought of Thor being dressed up as a bride happened, Loki was the first one to go. They went to Freya, and Loki was the one that said, "Look, I will go out of Asgard, to this safe, known territory of ours, and I will." The land of the giants, Jotunheim, is... The giants and the Aesir don't get along. They're like warring tribes. So you're going into enemy territory, and Loki volunteers to do this. Mm-hmm. So, like, again, on some aspects, Loki does have... he is helpful to the gods. There is a reason he keeps them around. But on the other side of that, he also causes some really...
Does he die in the end?
Loki...
Is there a death?
All of that. I mean, most of these gods do die during Ragnarok.
You just described the plot of Cats. You realize that, right?
Stop it. Oh my gosh. Yes, there's even like resurrection. They're not in a tire, but
oh yeah, spoiler, if you haven't seen Cats, it ends with a big tired cat's going to heaven. Anyway, you literally just described the plot of Cats.
Andrew Lloyd Webber. But Stop stealing from Norse mythology.
But I'm saying, like, Odin knew these kids were going to end up messed up like Loki. I mean, think about how hard Loki was partying. One's a serpent. One's a normal like a human.
Well, she's half dead, half alive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some drinking and some drugs involved. But I mean, none of these are like. Odin knew what was what. He wanted to get these kids in boarding school and maybe like plan for a 401k.
Well, here I actually have another theory on that. Odin, like I said, got the prophecy about what's going to happen with these beings during Ragnarok. So he knows that, but he doesn't know what takes place in between. Especially in this story. I tend to think, and I could be completely wrong about this, I probably am, but in my own headcanon, I think Odin brings some of this upon himself because Fenrir, he's this wolf pup, and he's being raised in Asgard by the Aesir. And yeah, he's growing really big. But I think the fact that, like, you bound him, like, he wasn't doing, it's not said that he's, like, doing evil things while he's in Asgard hanging out with these guys. I almost think, like, the reason he gets so angry and has to break those chains and is like, I'm going to kill Odin during Ragnarok is the fact that they tied him up with this unbreakable chain and stuck a sword in his mouth so he couldn't close his mouth. It's just, I almost think it was like self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, what Odin did is what caused these guys, especially Fenrir and Jormungandr, to almost want to seek their revenge on the gods at Ragnarok. I almost wonder, had he not treated them that way, I think it's that weird thing about fate. Like, is there free will? Is there self-determination? Or is it set in stone? And no matter what happened, we would have got to the same outcome.
I think what's interesting, and when you were just describing that in the beginning, that was Act 2 of Cats.
Oh my God.
I'm not letting this go.
I'm going to have to see Cats now, is apparently the moral of today's
Like, if you
story.
just replace everything you said, wolf, with cats, I think we've just solved the case here.
So who in Cats gets who in Cats willingly sacrifices their hand to save the world?
It's not so much a hand, but I think it's a tail.
Are you just making this up?
I don't think I am.
I've never seen Cats, so I can't comment on this at all whatsoever.
It's literally, it's gobbledygook. I don't know. I just think it's funny because now that we've talked about it, it's all I can think about is cats.
Great.
I know. I'm sorry.
It's
I'm totally
okay.
like taking this train off the tracks here.
Yes, it's off the tracks.
But okay, so let's think of some. Okay, so we had 6 impossible things.
6 impossible things. Yeah.
Let's go through with each. Like, I'll name 3 impossible things for myself, and you can name 3 impossible things for you.
Okay.
Okay. Am I going first?
Yes, you're going first because this is your game and your idea.
So my first 3 things: easy open tabs. That's one impossible thing. 2, not getting numbed at the dentist is an impossible thing. Numbing at the dentist, not going to happen for me. And 3 would have to be... Ooh, I don't know if I have a third.
It's your game. You better think of a third.
Oh God. Okay, there's pressure. Ooh, liking birds.
Yeah, it's impossible for you to like birds. Let's be true.
Easy open tabs, dentist, and birds.
And
That's
birds.
mine. All right. What are your 3 impossible?
My impossible things. Putting eye drops in my own eyes.
Or in general.
Watching anyone just... No.
That counts as one. You can't, like...
I'm like, it's just all eye things. So that's my first one. My second impossible thing. Giving up all of my hippos.
Okay. And that's a lot of hippos.
That's a lot of hippos. Most of them I would be like, okay, I could get rid of these. But there's like one that I swear that hippopotamus is going to be cremated with me.
We have to preface this that I think you have... How many hippos do you have in your collection right now?
I haven't actually counted in a while.
Over 100?
Oh, yeah, for
easily.
sure. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe 200 or more?
I probably have more than 2.
Yeah.
I'm probably somewhere in the high 3s to low 4s.
Okay. And your last impossible thing?
Oh, my last impossible thing. This is going to sound so awfully bad, but I know that it is true.
Okay.
It's giving up monsters.
Oh, yeah, you tried. You had a good run for a little bit.
I did.
Okay, so I think what we should do is make this put this on Twitter and ask what people's impossible things are. What your impossible things are.
Yes.
I think that would be interesting.
That'd be cool. And then we'll collect all of those impossible things and find some dwarves and have them forge something magical and amazing out of them.
I know a guy.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, we got this. I think we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
But
so I think like I know that this was really kind of like this story is the binding of Fenrir, so it's really about how they get Fenrir bound before Ragnarok. But my kind of tie in to your story was really the Tyr sacrifice, Tyr knowing that he is knowing basically he's going to lose his hand. He knows what the Aesir's game is here. He knows that they have to bind Fenrir. And so he, of all of the gods, is like, okay, I will put my hand in Fenrir's mouth, which almost is...
Did he pick his dominant hand?
It didn't say, but it was his right hand. I'm a right-handed.
They just assume everyone's right-handed.
I just assume everyone's right-handed.
Rude.
But also, like, for me right now, having my hand was horrifically burned by a airbag.
I'm sorry. I'm not laughing at your accident.
Although she is. So right now I'm like, I would willingly put my hand into Fenrir's mouth.
There's just a part in Cats where one of them gets horrifically burned.
Oh my God, stop it. So, yes, back to Tyr's sacrifice. I really liked that part. I appreciate that. And it's a little sad for me too, because I kind of have this headcanon, like Tyr's the only one brave enough to feed Fenrir when he's a young pup. So, I mean, like, if you've ever had, like, a little puppy around and you're the one feeding it, that puppy bonds to you. Just by nature. You're, like, its provider and its protector. And so I really hate that it's, like, the one god that possibly had some type of connection or bond with Fenrir is the one that ends up putting his hand in Fenrir's mouth, and Fenrir has really no choice but to take that sacrifice. So there's that layer there that always just kind of tugs at my heartstrings a little bit, even though I shouldn't feel any type of empathy for this wolf, because again, he kills the Allfather at Ragnarok.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Every time you say Ragnarok, I'm not gonna lie, I think of Thor and Ragnarok, the Marvel movie, and I'm sorry.
The actual Ragnarok is nothing like that.
Aww.
Although Loki does captain or pilot a ship in that movie, I think.
You know, I don't recall.
I think he does.
I was just focused on the Thor haircut. Let's just be real.
Yeah. So we probably will cover, I shouldn't say probably will, I know for a fact that at some point in time, Ragnarok, the actual Ragnarok, not the Marvel version of Ragnarok, will come up in the podcast.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, I have it on the list already.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. I'm excited.
Yeah, so we'll get to see what kind of the differences are between the Marvel movie and the actual story from Myth.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, before we roll into the murder, you wanna what's going on in your tea today?
Oh yes, so I'm very excited. So the guy that does this podcast also has a kind of an Etsy store. So it's Fjorn's Hall, or Fjorn the Skald, and he has like a northern herbalist tea shop, and so he has Norse god inspired or themed teas, and I am currently sipping on the Bragi themed tea, because of course I had to tell a story, so I'm like, oh, let's just drink the tea of the god of poetry. So it's called Night Owl, and I'm really enjoying it.
It smells fantastic. I did pass on tea tonight because I'm a little hot right now in the room, but I also drank a lot of Red Bull today, so the tea smells fantastic, first of all, and I'm kind of upset I didn't try it, but it just smells fantastic. We're big tea people, so it's always exciting to see it. Plus, like, the writing, I love typography. I do typography, and whoever hand wrote that, I'm assuming it was you, but or not you. Sorry. Well, not you personally, but
Fjorn the Skald.
But Fjorn the Skald, and I mean, your handwriting is gorgeous. I'm just gonna shout that out right now. I love it, and I want to make a font out of it.
Yeah.
So
she might message you about that.
I was the first thing I said was like, "Ooh, look at this writing."
Yeah. So please,
cool.
like, if you are into tea, and me, I kind of like to I like to kind of pair tea. So if I'm like reading something Egyptian, like I'm gonna go for a Karkade or something.
Put you in the mood.
Put me in the mood. So when I saw that there was like Norse themed teas, I was like, oh yes, what do I need? I need these for reading all these sagas.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So yeah, if you are into tea, or just like, again, I like # support creators.
Absolutely.
So his shop, you can find him on Twitter, and it's at north_herbalist, or the northernherbalist.etsy.com. And then him and his podcast, you can find his Twitter at Fjorn, that's FJORN _the_scald. SKALD for those of you that don't know how to spell that one. Or you can go to fjorns-hall.com.
Awesome.
So yeah, give him a follow, a like, a listen. The podcast is great. The tea is amazing. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess we did this so backwards. I'm thrown off right now.
Can't you just edit it to flip it around again?
I mean, I could, but why would I?
I don't know.
Let's just let it
We
ride.
have an order, ma'am. I'm just kidding.
You were the one that brought up cats. And so that was a perfect lead into the cat's footsteps, because there were no cats.
First of all, we started talking about cats this morning, and it's just rolled into a whole thing today.
Yes.
And I've also talked about Hamilton a total of over 10 times today as well.
Oh, that's being very generous.
Anyway.
Yeah, so...
First of all, Hamilton is life, but whatever.
Right. I think this is like every reaction we've mentioned Hamilton the musical.
Okay, I just want tickets. I need tickets. I'm just gonna, my
if
kids...
she doesn't win this lottery, there's probably gonna be tears, and I don't think I've ever seen cries in Kim's eyes.
Never. Except when my dog died. No, I'm not gonna do this right now.
No, please don't.
Okay.
So yeah, on to the murder and dismemberment.
Let's get into that.
Yes.
So, okay. We may edit this little portion out. I'm not sure. But we were talking about doing an extended...
No, we're not going to edit this out. So you're either committing to doing an extended murder episode...
Okay.
Or I will talk more about Norse mythology.
I don't know. You know how I feel about commitment.
Okay, so we'll just put this out there.
We're putting it out there.
We're going to attempt to do an extended murder episode, which will come out a week from today's launch.
Jesus.
Or if that doesn't pan out, I will do an extended mythology.
We thought about swapping off, basically, and some of our stories do constitute a little bit more because we are doing them in the storytelling format. So we thought maybe you guys as listeners wanted to dive in a little more deep on some of these, because I know Kristen's stories go way down. They can go real broad, and it's really interesting, and sometimes you can't fit it all in one story.
Right.
And so I think sometimes with the murder, and the reason why that idea came up for me, I was finally thinking about it, was so there's a bunch of tie-ins to my story. There's a few loose ends. So I'll just put it out there to start. We had a letter that was sent in to the police chief, Madowitz, and it was signed by the killer, allegedly.
Right.
The thing is that's interesting is that I didn't bring it up, and I said I wasn't going to cover the story, but I'm going to talk about it in maybe the extended murder, was that the letter came from California, and the tie-in from this and the way the killings were done are related, very similar to the Black Dahlia murder. Ooh. So the Black Dahlia murder happened very close to the time this letter was written and when the guy may have left Cleveland. So they really had no suspects on this or anything. And I'm not sure. I want to follow up on where he said the bodies were buried in Hollywood. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that area, but Century Boulevard and Western and Crenshaw are kind of down in that area.
Right. I was wondering about that when you were reading the cold open, and I was just like, oh, okay, these are, California. And then all of a sudden we get to the murder story and we're in Cleveland. I was like, what's going on there?
I thought it was interesting because the letter came from after the fact.
Right.
And it was kind of, there is speculation that perhaps the same guy could be, because in the manner in which these murders happened were in the manner in which Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, was murdered as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I
think that would warrant an extended murder episode.
It would warrant an extended murder. And so it was interesting to see that tie-in for this murder, and the fact that Eliot Ness was a very prominent person back in the Prohibition age, anti-liquor jazz and that whole thing, and the fact that we mentioned Capone, the Untouchables, and then all these things. There was really no one that they never found the guy. There was suspects, Elliot Ness knew there was one guy who may have done it, but then he checked himself into a mental hospital, and he was untouchable, no pun intended.
Right.
And then it was just like all these people were murdered, beheaded, and dismembered. Yeah.
I feel really bad for all of the people I can't imagine just like, I'm taking a walk, or I'm going down to the river, or even like I'm in the National Guard and I'm standing on a bridge and just finding all of these body parts strewn all over the city. Like, how horrific would that be? I couldn't. I just, no.
I know. And
I'd
the thing is that's interesting is like they got a bunch of coroners on the case. The body parts are floating in the river. I mean, the way they were dumped, kind of the same MO as even, again, the Dahlia, because she was just kind of left in an open space there, and it was the same kind of, very similar. Drained of blood, no blood in the area, that kind of thing. A lot of the bodies, very few, there's 3 stages that they ID how wounds happen, and that's called, I had to write notes, sorry, because I'm like, Antemortem is if it happens before death, and then there's perimortem that happens like of death, like during death, and then there's premortem, which obviously happens after death.
Postmortem.
And yeah, postmortem, sorry. There's anyway, we got it. And so a lot of these, they could tell that they had died after, they had died during, and some was not I'm over this. And so, sorry, my phone keeps going off. And some that happened, there's So it was just interesting because they were all drained of blood. They're preserved. They were like possibly frozen. And it was like they had been dead a year. And then the guy in the letters claiming medical experiments, but it wasn't really clear, like, what was happening. So
did they ever identify because a couple of times you mentioned that they found a chemical on the body and it could cause the body to turn like a bright red. Did we ever find out, or was it said what that chemical was?
No, they just knew it was like a preserving agent at some time. It wasn't like formaldehyde or anything. Okay. They didn't really preface it in the research that I've done, but like a preserving agent, it wasn't in formalin or anything along those lines. So we don't know.
Nothing you could track.
Yeah, and it turns the skin red and leathery, which was weird. So it may have been tanning agent.
Oh, okay. That would make sense.
Yeah, I'm not positive. So it was just, I don't know. It was happening over a couple years. And the thing is, like, they made a bunch of death masks of the victims, which I'll put on the website, that are still, if you live in Cleveland, they're in the Cleveland Police Museum, and you can see all of them. They're still on display, and they're pretty sad. They're done really well. And it always kind of creeps me out when you have people that go missing or unidentified, and the fact that, like, no one knows who they are.
Yeah, for me, like especially when you were like listing out all the tattoos this guy had. I knew that there was a reason that you were doing this. For no one to be able to identify that person. This wasn't in the time of like the internet where you could just be like, hey, Amber Alert or whatever, and just like, be like a top trend and get all over the internet and paper and get in front of a bunch of different people. Yeah. So I guess if he wasn't like local or was a transient, people might not have known. But I'm just like, that's just, it's one thing if it's just someone who's been dismembered that has no distinguishing characteristics, but to be that detailed about what all the tattoos are and for someone to not find him that one was particularly sad to me.
It's like the murders went on for about 3 years, and it is sad because I'm thinking like noticeable tattoos, that kind of, like, especially like you were saying, that guy, it's like maybe he was in the service. Navy man,
like
something with the anchor.
And
so here are the pictures of the death masks. I'm gonna show her. Me. They're pretty detailed, and I am just really surprised that that's the tattoo guy.
Yeah, but for the time that these were done, those are pretty.
They're very detailed, and they did put them in papers, and they were distributed, and it's like, again, that whole missing. Sorry, I'm talking with the missing person thing, where no one knew who these people were, and that's just so like. Scary.
I would feel like that's
like that someone had nobody that
cared.
Like that's one of my biggest. Like, it's so depressing.
That's like one of my biggest fears. Like if I were to go missing and then they just like find my body and no one identifies me, and that would be.
Yeah, I'd know if you were missing.
Thanks.
I know. But it's like, yeah, it's true though. But you get those sad cases of people like who died and they didn't know and found them until and it's just really unfortunate that it happens. And I'm just surprised with all these victims that no one ID'd them, especially how publicized it was and how much media attention it got, especially in the area. And just they couldn't possibly ID the one woman, but I mean, I don't know why her son didn't ID her based on her death mask. It was kind of it was weird that they couldn't positively ID that lady with the dental issues. I don't know.
I do think it was pretty there was a lot of bravado of the killer. The National Guard got called in, not for this, but the National Guard got called in. And that he's still killing while the National Guard is in town. That's confidence.
I think it was kind of sad the way they went about it. I think there was a lot of stereotyping because they went through a poorer area assuming it was someone from a poorer area.
Now, was that because you called it the hobo jungle?
They had so the way they described it was where the river was, there was a lot of makeshift houses and tents, and it was essentially I hate to use the word homeless, but homeless camp,
tent city,
yeah. And so
was there electricity running to this place?
Didn't say.
Okay.
I'm assuming maybe not.
Yeah.
Some of the homes were frames of houses, and people were just living there because the Depression. I mean, it was the end of the Depression where the rich were getting richer, poor were getting poorer. Some areas were thriving, some weren't. And so they really focused on this area. And, Elliot Ness went in with his people and basically just burned that whole thing to the ground. And the murders were still happening. Yeah. So
that part really, I could see why the people of that town were so upset. Yeah. For me, it was just we knew that those bodies had been refrigerated or frozen for a period of time. And then when you were describing this, I pictured it very much like a tent city.
Exactly.
Not electric. I'm who there, and it's multiple bodies, it's not one body, who there in that shanty town has got these freezers on electricity holding these bodies for an extended period of time? That for me was such a miscarriage of justice on Elliot Ness's part. It was almost kind of with the Axemen, where it's just I felt the cops just needed to give that appearance to the town and the city that they were doing something, that it didn't matter who they were doing it to, or that they didn't have any evidence
showing
against
progress.
These people. Exactly.
Yeah, and it was sad because I don't know, I assume in that kind of community, people they help each other. I mean, everyone's in a bad area, not a bad area, but a bad spot or going through rough times. And I like to think that they maybe know kind of everyone in that area. Yeah. And I think, they've already lost everything and then they're losing it again. And then whether or not, there'll be a home or a tent or wherever they lived. So yeah, it really gave him a bad reputation because I think he was flying off this whole Capone arrest and he had this story of everyone assumed, he's this great outstanding guy, but then he ends up losing this case, this case didn't really work for him. They never caught the guy. And then he ends up getting in his drunk driving accident, tries to cover it up, and it was just,
which was hilarious. The hero of prohibition ends up with a DUI.
Yeah, there's that. And so it was sad because his life pretty much, that was it. I mean, he died, he, failed businesses, failed marriages, and he just nonstop failure. It was so I mean, I don't think it didn't end well for anybody in this story, unfortunately. And yeah, it was pretty awful, but they still haven't found it. But I think it will be interesting how this will kind of loop back to our Dahlia.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
I would like to hear that extended murder.
Yeah, it's been interesting. That's for sure. So, yeah, it was a long one. There was a lot happening over a span of 3 years, and again, it's just I just can't believe that still now and many years later that they still have no idea who the people are and still don't have a suspect. And the two they had the guy who mysteriously died in prison, and
that quote unquote hung himself.
Yeah. And then the guy who went to the mental institution.
Yeah.
So they never said, I'll have to, I know he died in custody, so I mean, he may not have done the Black Dahlia, but I'll have to look into that.
To see. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was again, there was just like so many bodies and just body parts just floating around in that town at that time. It's just, and then nothing after that. It just kind of like,
he went to California.
yeah, probably.
It's
creepy.
It's very like Jack the Ripper-ish to me in a way, because like it was all those killings, everyone was freaking out, and then it just stopped.
Yeah.
So you have to assume they died, got in custody for something else maybe,
Right.
or went
Moved.
somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then it'd be interesting.
Because again, like we talked about with the Axemen, these type of people, they don't just suddenly stop. It's not like a switch suddenly gets turned off.
Yeah.
And they don't feel this compulsion anymore.
Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody out there, it's not me obviously, who has tracked this, that had to have tracked a map or something.
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be. If not, I mean, maybe that will be my old lady retirement project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Linking all these crimes together. Yeah, that's...
Be interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure there's someone out there. There has to be. There has to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that was the Cleveland torso murders, and
Great.
you need to do cats. I'm gonna end this.
It's not a myth.
Is it though?
The Andrew Lloyd Webber play is not based off mythology.
We just pretty much described it in the first, like, your synopsis in the beginning of this reaction.
Okay. I will do a comparison, maybe a blog post. I will watch Cats, and I will do a compare and contrast.
You heard it. She said it. She said it.
Between the Binding of Fenrir and Cat. I think we're good.
I think we're good.
Yeah. So we'll see you guys in 2 weeks with a regular episode of the podcast. Which will be episode 7.
Gosh, yes. And
episode 7, and the name.
It's
we always do this.
it's Drink Me.
Drink Me.
And we're gonna talk about poison.
Poison. Thanks for listening to Murder and Myths, a bi-weekly podcast. This was episode 6, Cut My Life into Pieces.
Don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite listening platform. If you have any story ideas or suggestions, you can find us at murderandmyths.com or on Twitter at murderandmyths.
Join us in 2 weeks for episode 7, Drink Me.
And as always, come for the murder
And stay for the myths.